Hey guys, tonight we're going to creep through a stone doorway, duck beneath an archway older than your country, and shuffle into a room where the only sound is the whisper of ink on parchment, and maybe one monk sniffling quietly in the corner. You're about to live the quiet, ink-splattered, spine-hunching life of a medieval scribe. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this. Not because of swords or plagues or anything cinematic, but because you'll fall asleep halfway through transcribing the 5th chapter of Leviticus. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment with your location and local time. I read them all, even if I'm pretending to be asleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying on a straw-filled mattress that might as well be made of bricks. The smell of damp stone and candle wax hangs in the air. It's still dark outside. So dark it might as well be yesterday. No rooster crows, no birds chirp. Instead, the wake-up call comes from the cold bell tower tolling matins. It's barely 3 a.m., time to rise and not shine exactly. More like quietly shuffle through centuries of ritual. You wrap yourself in a coarse woolen robe, the color of tired oatmeal, and move through the dim hallway of the monastery. The floor is cold. You think you might have just stepped on a beetle, but you can't curse, and you definitely can't cry. Not here. You're a novice in training, remember? You pass the chapel where a few early risers are already in silent prayer. They glance at you with the sleepy eyes of men who have copied the Psalms by hand. More than once. And they know. You have so many psalms ahead of you. The scriptorium awaits. An austere stone room with tall, narrow windows that barely admit light, even at noon. There's no roaring fire, no warm welcome, just long wooden desks, tiny stools, and a chill that nestles in your bones, like it pays rent. You find your place. It's the same one every day. Same stool, same desk, same scratch marks where someone before you dug lines into the wood out of either boredom or quiet madness. There's a candle stub flickering weakly beside your quill knife and inkhorn. The parchment, cut from calf skin, lies rolled and waiting. The head scribe enters, Brother Adalbert. He's got eyebrows that could double as paintbrushes and a squint like he's spent half a century glaring at the letter G. He doesn't speak, he just nods. That means begin. You draw your knife across the quill tip one last time. A quick prayer muttered under your breath, and then ink. The black syrupy fluid, your lifeblood, is stirred from a lidded jar. You dip the nib of your quill in carefully. The ink clings to the feather like it knows what you're about to put it through. Your hands shake slightly, your breath fogs the surface of the page, and you make your first stroke. A single, long, looping letter. I. Congratulations. It only took you 45 minutes to write one sentence. Only 999 more pages to go. There's something beautiful about the slowness, though. Something monastic. Meditative. Repetitive. Yes, but somehow sacred. You're not writing your own thoughts. You're a channel, a tool, a conduit of words copied for those who can't read and might never see the inside of a book in their entire lives. And you won't just be copying anything today. You'll be transcribing holy texts. The Vulgate Bible in Latin. Yes, Latin. A language you don't speak but are expected to copy perfectly. It's fine. What could go wrong? Every mistake is a prayer for mercy, and you pray a lot. Now here's a fun reality. You're not alone in this freezing script lab. There are 6 others around you. Brother Marcus, who hums through his teeth and was once caught doodling a dragon on a page of Exodus. Sister Clarissa from the adjoining convent, who has sharper calligraphy than anyone and knows it. And a few younger novices who are still learning how not to blot every third letter. Your writing is supervised by Adalbert, yes, but also by the light itself. You have a limited window, literally. The best light hits around 9 a.m., when the sun slices through the slats, just enough to show the raised grain of the parchment. Before that, you're relying on flickering candlelight, which makes the ink dance and your headaches blossom. You pause for a moment to stretch your fingers. You flex them, then squeeze the edge of your desk to ground yourself. You look down and realize your ink has dried slightly, creating a darker hue in the center of your last letter. Scholars still argue whether this effect was ever intentional, or just a happy accident caused by how slowly scribes had to dip and redip. Speaking of debates, some historians think scribes used coded marks to protest against their conditions. Tiny flourishes, deliberate errors near their names, little medieval acts of rebellion. Others believe those quirks were just the natural result of spending hours a day bent over a desk with numb fingers and low blood sugar. Either way, you're tempted to sneak in a doodle of a snail jousting a knight. But no, Brother Adalbert just passed behind you, his eyebrow raised like an accusing falcon. Back to work. Eventually, the sky begins to lighten. Your ink jar is half empty, your candle has burned low, and your wrist feels like it's aging in reverse, like it's turning back into bone. You glance at the other scribes. Some are leaning back to crack their spines. One is muttering what sounds like a confession. Clarissa yawns so hard her veil nearly shifts. And just when you think you're about to break, a bell rings. Not lunch, not freedom, just time for prayer. You set down your quill. Carefully, you cap the ink. You cover the parchment with a cloth to keep dust and fingerprints away. And then, silently, you rise with the others and move toward the chapel. No talking, no sighs, just the slow shuffle of ink-stained feet on cold stone. And as you walk, you can't help but marvel, through the exhaustion and the ache, that every letter you wrote this morning, every careful curve of a quill, just might outlast you by 1,000 years. Not bad for a job that doesn't even pay. By now you've had your first prayer of the day, and if you're lucky, a crumb of bread and a mug of lukewarm ale that tastes faintly like regret. Welcome to the rhythm of monastic life. You're back from chapel, stomach growling slightly, but the bell has spoken. It's time to return to your desk and to the endless dance of ink and patience. You ease yourself back onto that same stool. It groans under you like it also didn't want to come back from break. Your robe shifts around you, thick wool, slightly scratchy, dyed with nothing fancy, because vanity is a sin and silk is for sinners. The sleeves are long and get in the way, just enough to make you wish you had scissors, but not enough to justify mutiny. You tuck them in carefully so they don't drag through the ink again. Last time that happened, you ruined an entire page of St. Luke, and Brother Adalbert stared at you like you just sneezed on the Ark of the Covenant. Now let's talk about the ritual of the robe. This isn't some fashion-forward monastic lookbook. Each robe is regulation, ankle-length, cinched with a rope and patched in places where mice may or may not have taken a bite. And you don't just throw it on and go. No, there's a routine to dressing in the morning. Undergarments first, linen always, then the robe, then the scapular, a long strip of fabric worn front to back over the shoulders. It's supposed to symbolize humility. It also makes it harder to scratch your back. There's also a hood, but don't get excited. You're not a mysterious wizard. The hood is for warmth and modesty, and occasionally to nap behind when no one's watching. Not that you'd ever do that, obviously. Scribes live by a rule book, literally. The rule of Saint Benedict. If you're in a Benedictine monastery, it's not a suggestion, it's your schedule, your diet, your moral compass, and your HR department rolled into one. And that rule says your day is going to be split between prayer, manual labor, and reading, most of which ends up being writing for you. Your scribe routine goes something like this. Wake at 3 a.m., matins, copy until dawn, lauds at sunrise, then more copying. Breakfast around 7 or 8 a.m., depending on the abbey, then copying, mid-morning prayer, copying, a bit of manual labor, usually garden work or helping in the kitchen, then, surprise, more copying. Basically, if you're not copying, you're praying. If you're not praying, you're copying. And if you're doing anything else, someone will ask why. You develop muscle memory. Your body adapts to the rhythm. Your wrist finds the right tension. Your eye learns to spot misaligned margins from across the room. You breathe in sync with the scratch of your quill. It becomes something deeper than a job. Not quite a trance, more like a discipline, like monks with hammers, only your hammer is a feather, and your stone is vellum. Now remember how you thought this would be a quiet, solitary life. Think again. You're constantly surrounded by other scribes, many of whom are mumbling under their breath, correcting themselves, or occasionally snoring with their eyes open. You have to coordinate, you have to follow cues, and you have to be hyper-aware of the silent sign system. See, talking is forbidden, but communication isn't. So you've all developed a rich vocabulary of hand signs and glances. Want to borrow someone's ink? There's a gesture for that. Need to be excused for a bathroom break? That one involves raising 2 fingers like a medieval peace sign and hoping the supervisor doesn't pretend not to see you. Clarissa has even perfected the art of coughing twice to signal when Adalbert is doing his rounds. She's basically the MI6 of the scriptorium. Some monks even invent little sign languages of their own. There's one scribe, Brother Hugo, who communicates entirely in eyebrow lifts and beard twitches. You're never quite sure if he's complimenting your work or threatening to curse your family. Either way, you nod politely. Here's something historians still argue about: how strictly these routines were enforced. Some believe every hour was scheduled down to the minute, with bells for every task and little room for deviation. Others argue that monasteries, especially in rural areas, were more relaxed and adapted the rules based on weather, resources, or the abbot's mood. Some even think scribes had free periods to rest their eyes and walk the cloister. But let's be honest, if you're copying the Book of Numbers by hand, every minute feels scheduled anyway. Of course, every routine has its chaos. One day the ink spills. Another, the firewood delivery is late and the room stays cold all day. Or, maybe, just maybe, you miscopy a line from Proverbs and only realize it 4 paragraphs later, forcing you to start the entire page again. Yes, that happens. Yes, it's soul-crushing. No, you don't get to scream. There are also the feast days. On paper they sound festive. In reality, they're more like a slightly upgraded Tuesday. Maybe better food, maybe an extra candle, and yes, a different prayer. But the routine remains. The ink still flows. The pages must still be copied. You get used to odd things, like the sound of a dozen quills scratching in unison, like the way candlelight makes your work look better than it actually is, like the moments when you accidentally fall into sync with another scribe, both of you dipping your quills at the same time, lifting your heads together, stretching in mirrored silence. It's almost musical. Every once in a while, there's a break in routine, a visiting dignitary, a new shipment of parchment, a plague outbreak. You know, normal medieval things. But even then, the work endures, because for the monastery, these texts are more than words. They're life, culture, scripture, and you ink-stained monk with aching fingers, you are the bridge between past and future. Sometimes when you pause to flex your hands, you wonder what your words will mean to someone 1,000 years from now. Will they notice the way your script shifted after your morning prayer? Will they know you were tired when you copied Genesis 19? Will they laugh at the coffee-colored stain that bled across the Sermon on the Mount because you sneezed mid-stroke? Some might, some won't. But still, you copy. Still, you write. And if you're lucky, you get through the day with minimal corrections, minimal burns from the candle wax, and only one small doodle hidden behind a large capital letter. Because hey, routines may be strict, but nobody said you couldn't sneak in a tiny rabbit holding a sword. You probably never thought much about ink. Modern ink comes in neat little cartridges or disposable pens you buy in a 12-pack. Forget in a drawer and then find 6 months later, dried out and bitter, just like your dreams of becoming organized. But here, as a medieval scribe, ink is everything. It's the medium of your life's work, the very essence of your purpose. And unlike that sad ballpoint you chewed on in school, this ink is alive. It stains fingers, it thickens in the cold, it runs when the parchment is too slick, and most alarmingly, it takes hours to make. Sometimes days, sometimes longer if you don't want to get poisoned. The day begins like most others, groggily in the cold, with a prayer you don't mess anything up. But today, instead of heading straight for your desk, you're headed for the apothecary room, the sacred, slightly spooky corner of the monastery where ingredients are kept in jars. The air smells like fermented herbs, and at least 3 things on every shelf could kill you. You're here to mix ink. First ingredient, gallnuts. Not a typo, gallnuts. These are weird little growths found on oak trees caused by parasitic wasps that lay their eggs inside leaves. The tree, not appreciating the intrusion, grows a knobbly, tumor-like ball around the egg. And voila, a gallnut. It's essentially botanical drama in a nutshell. These gallnuts are harvested, dried, and then ground into powder. Add iron sulfate, usually made from rusty nails or oxidized metal shavings, into the mix, and you're halfway to ink. But don't celebrate yet. You now need a binding agent to keep it all together. Enter gum arabic, the sticky sap of the acacia tree. It helps the ink flow smoothly from your quill instead of behaving like a toddler on sugar. The final ingredient? Liquid. Sometimes it's rainwater, sometimes it's wine, and yes, sometimes it's your tears. The monks prefer using wine because apparently even the ink gets a little holy buzz. Also, it acts as a mild preservative, which helps if you're planning to write the entire New Testament before your 80th birthday. Now here comes the fun part. You mix everything together in a clay pot over low heat. It starts out looking like something a dragon coughed up. But slowly, as the ingredients dissolve and darken, the brew thickens into a rich black liquid. It smells metallic and slightly sour like wet pennies and overripe grapes. You stir it slowly with a bone spoon, muttering a few protective prayers just in case. The ink is temperamental. Too much iron and it turns gray. Too little and it fades to brown before the century is out. Once it's cooled and filtered through cloth, you ladle it into a small horn or glass jar. And just like that, you're holding centuries in your hand. That's ink. Living ink. Iron gall ink. It bites into the parchment. It oxidizes over time, growing darker, more permanent. This is the ink that will carry saints' names, royal decrees, secret jokes, and the mistakes of tired scribes across the ages. Historians love this stuff. They've studied it under microscopes, trying to unlock why some pages from 900 AD look brand new, while others from the 1200s look like they were dunked in coffee. Some scholars argue the mixture changed depending on geography. Mediterranean monks favored red tints. Irish scribes added soot for extra darkness. And in one case, someone used crushed beetles, which honestly raises more questions than answers. And yes, sometimes the ink went wrong. Very wrong. Like, eats through the parchment wrong. There's one story, true or not, who knows, about a scribe whose ink batch was too acidic. He proudly wrote an entire psalter, only to discover that, over the years, the ink ate clean through the pages. The book disintegrated like paper lace, and he had to start again. I mean, imagine that meeting with the abbot. But most of the time, it worked. And when it worked, it was magic. You dip your quill into that dark pool, lift it slowly, and watch the drop hang from the tip. Perfect, poised, weightless. Then you'd bring it to the parchment and begin again, stroke after stroke, letter after letter, sentence after sentence. You start to learn the ink's moods. When it's too runny, your letters bleed. When it thickens from the cold, your quill skips. Sometimes you whisper to it. Don't laugh. You're not the only one. Clarissa swears her ink listens. Brother Marcus hums to his. One guy, nobody knows his name because he doesn't speak, draws smiley faces in the corner of his ink jar and prays to them for steadiness. Of course, there are other colors too. Red, made from cinnabar, or red lead. Blue, made from lapis lazuli, which is absurdly expensive and only used on the most important manuscripts, like for drawing halos or Jesus's robe. Green was from verdigris, scraped from copper. Gold? Real gold leaf, pressed and brushed on with egg whites. You only get to use gold if you've been a very good scribe and nobody caught you doodling a horse with human feet last week. There's even invisible ink, but not the fun spy kind. Some medieval scribes use lemon juice or milk to leave messages that only appear when gently heated. Scholars still debate whether these were training notes, secret protests, or just monks getting really bored. Speaking of boredom, you may be wondering, didn't scribes ever mess with the ink? Oh yes, pranks happened. Some swapped ingredients, some added too much sulfur to make it stink. There's one marginal note in a 12th century text where a scribe complains, "This ink is foul and I curse its maker." We feel you, buddy. We really do. And now here you are, back at your desk. Ink jar to your left, quill in hand. The fresh batch you mixed yourself glistens dark and full of promise. You breathe slowly, you focus. You whisper a tiny thanks to the oak tree, the angry wasp, the rusted nail, and the grape that became wine. Because without them, there's no ink. And without ink, there's no book. And without books, this whole civilization thing, yeah, it probably wouldn't have made it very far. You dip your quill, you press the nib to the parchment, and with the faintest shh, like a sigh in the silence, the words begin again. By now you're starting to realize that nothing in your medieval scribe life comes easily. Not the robes, not the routines, certainly not the ink, and definitely not the page you're writing on. Because before it ever held a single letter of Latin, your page was mooing in a meadow. Yes, parchment used to be a cow, or a sheep, or, if you were feeling fancy, a young calf. Vellum, the luxury model of parchment, was made from calf skin, thin, soft, creamy white. Vellum was basically the medieval iPad Pro. Regular parchment, still high quality, still expensive, still required an entire animal. Let's walk through that process together, slowly, gently, and with full appreciation for just how long this all took. Because remember, nothing about your life as a scribe is fast, including your paper. First, the skin, freshly removed, from the animal. We won't linger on that part too long because, well, bedtime. But once it was removed, it wasn't immediately usable. No, it needed to be treated. First, the skin was soaked in lime water, an alkaline solution strong enough to loosen hair and fat, but not so strong that it damaged the skin. This soaking could take days, sometimes over a week, and yes, it smelled like a failed science project in July. After the soak, the skin was stretched on a wooden frame called a hearse, not to be confused with a hearse, though, honestly, if you were the cow, the distinction wouldn't matter. You fasten the hide at each corner with cords, tightening it until the skin is taut like a drum. Then comes the scraping, and, you guessed it, more scraping. A crescent-shaped blade, called a lunulum, is used to strip away the remaining hair, fat, and tissue. This stage requires real finesse. Too gentle and you leave fuzz. Too aggressive and you punch a hole straight through the hide. The margin of error? About as wide as a hair, literally. This stage often took place outdoors or in open sheds. The wind helped dry the skin as it was worked. And the drying process wasn't just waiting around, it was active. The craftsman would revisit the parchment over and over, adjusting the tension of the cords, scraping it smoother, wiping away residue, sanding it with pumice. It was hands-on, labor-intensive, and, bonus, frequently done by candlelight in freezing weather. By the time it was removed from the frame, the parchment had become something else entirely. The texture was now firm, lightly translucent, and slightly crinkly. When you run your fingers across it, it makes a soft, rasping sound. That's the sound of potential, and also of about 3 months of work. You cut it down to size using a sharp knife and a measuring string. Not a ruler, a string. Straight lines were optional. Most scribes used a stylus or lead point to mark the margins. Folding the sheet was common too. Each fold created a bifolium, or 2-page spread. Stack enough bifolia together and you had a quire. Stack multiple quires and you had a codex. Stack a few more and boom, a medieval manuscript. That's right, your book begins with a cow, some lime water, a lot of scraping, and ends with something that might be chained to a cathedral wall. But parchment wasn't just paper, it was alive. It had quirks, wrinkles, scars. Some sheets still had visible veins or tiny pinholes where the hair was too stubborn to be scraped. Sometimes you'd flip a page and find a perfect little round scar, proof that the cow once scratched itself on a thorn bush. It's weirdly touching. Scholars still debate whether scribes preferred blemish-free sheets or welcomed the imperfections. Some say spotless vellum was a sign of wealth. Others argue that even the rough parchment was treasured. After all, even flawed pages were more durable than papyrus and could last centuries, maybe longer than you, and certainly longer than your mattress. Here's a lesser-known fact. Parchment is erasable. That's right. If you made a mistake, you could scrape off the top layer with a knife, smooth it with pumice, and rewrite the word, but it left a ghost, an impression in the fibers that could still be seen in the right light. It's why modern historians can sometimes read erased text on medieval pages. Your mistakes don't really go away. They just fade into the background and wait for someone with better tools to uncover them. A bit like your high school poetry. Some scribes got so good at recycling that entire manuscripts were repurposed. These are called palimpsests, parchment pages that were scraped clean and used again, often decades later. You might be copying the Gospel of Mark over what used to be a Roman medical manual, and no one would know until some curious scholar 1,000 years later shines ultraviolet light on the page and says, "Wait, is that a recipe for eyeball ointment?" There's a bizarre charm to parchment. It doesn't always lay flat. It curls at the edges. It creaks when you turn it. If it's too dry, it cracks. Too moist, it warps. In short, it has mood swings, which means your life as a scribe includes parchment management. You weigh it down with stones. You press it under boards. You whisper soothing words when it curls in defiance. Okay, maybe not that last one, but Clarissa definitely sang to her pages once, and they did behave better after. You come to respect the parchment. It's not passive. It resists you. It challenges your ink, your quill, your patience. But when it accepts your words, when the ink settles perfectly, and the lines align, and the margins are clean, it feels like alchemy, like you didn't just write something. You bound your thoughts to a living thing. There's even superstition involved. Some monks believed flawed parchment carried spiritual blemishes, that copying the Psalms on scarred pages risked divine displeasure. Others thought certain pages whispered curses if reused improperly. One scribe left a note, "Do not write upon this skin, for the last did perish in madness." Was he serious? Was it a joke? Or was it the medieval version of, "Don't touch my stuff"? Either way, you leave that particular page alone. So now, as you sit at your desk with a new sheet stretched before you, cut, clean, scraped, and ready, you understand the weight of the blank page. It's not just a surface, it's the final form of a long, strange, slightly smelly journey. And now, it's yours to transform. You run your fingers over the edge. You feel the tiny ridges where the skin once stretched over ribs. You dip your quill. You lower your hand, and on the flesh of an animal long gone, you begin to write something meant to live forever. South, you've got your robe on. You've said your prayers. You mixed your ink like a wizard with seasonal allergies. And your parchment, freshly scraped, ghost-free, and slightly smelly, is laid out in front of you like the world's most judgmental blank canvas. Now comes the part where everything can fall apart with one bad stroke. The quill. Let's be clear. This isn't your kindergarten crayon. This isn't a $2.99 gel pen from the monastery gift shop. This is a feather, a literal feather, usually from a goose, sometimes a swan, and on rare, sacred occasions from a peacock. You're holding a glorified bird part and expecting it to be precise enough to copy the Word of God. No pressure. But first you have to prepare it, because contrary to popular belief, you don't just pluck a feather and dip it in ink like a dramatic poet. That feather's got to be cured, hardened, trimmed, carved, and then maintained like a fussy little diva. Let's walk through it. First, the curing process. You take a feather, preferably from the left wing, because it curves better in the right hand. Lefties were not having a great time in the Middle Ages, by the way. And you harden the shaft by soaking it in hot sand. Not boiling, not lukewarm, just the right temperature, or the shaft becomes brittle and shatters mid-copy, like your spirit during Leviticus. After curing, you trim off the barbs. Those are the fluffy bits, pretty but useless here. You keep just the hollow shaft, the calamus, and you cut it at an angle, then split the tip with a tiny slit. This allows the ink to flow smoothly, controlled by pressure. Too narrow and the ink won't come out. Too wide and it blobs like a toddler finger painting with motor oil. You then sharpen it with a special knife, called, predictably, a penknife. Yep, that's where the modern word comes from. This little blade becomes your closest companion. You carry it everywhere. You use it to trim, to correct, to sharpen. Some scribes even slept with theirs under the pillow. Because nothing says piety like cuddling a miniature blade. Once sharpened, you test it. On a spare piece of parchment, you make little strokes, lines, circles, alphabet loops. You adjust the pressure, the angle, you whisper encouragement, you threaten it gently. Clarissa taps hers on her nose like a wand. Brother Marcus kisses his like a superstitious gambler. Everyone has a ritual. And then, when it's just right, you begin. The quill becomes an extension of your hand, of your breath, of your focus. You dip it, tap it against the jar's edge to shake off the excess, and then press it to the page with surgical delicacy. It's not just about moving your hand, it's about balance. Tilt too far left, the ink pools. Too far right, the edge scratches and lifts the parchment. This is not for the impatient. Every few lines you must redip. Every dozen or so, you pause to sharpen. Not too much, just enough to keep the tip clean. Some days you go through 3 or 4 quills. Some texts, especially ones with dense lettering and complicated decoration, demand even more. You got a bundle of them in a leather pouch at your side. Each one is named. Don't laugh. Everyone does it. Your quills are your soldiers. You lose one mid-verse and it feels like betrayal. The worst is when one splits unexpectedly. You're halfway through a gilded capital letter G, and the quill suddenly goes rogue, spitting ink like a possessed duck. Congratulations, you've just ruined an entire day's work, and the abbot definitely noticed. Now, here's something not everyone knows. Different scripts require different nib cuts. For big Gothic letters, you need a broad chisel edge. For delicate Carolingian script, a finer, narrower point. Some scribes even use multiple quills for a single page. One for body text, one for headings, one for flourishes. Scholars still debate how standardized these practices were. Some argue monasteries had strict stylistic rules and manuals that detailed everything down to the angle of every E. Others suggest it was more fluid. Scribes trained by example, copying the style of their predecessors. There's evidence of regional variations too. Irish monks wrote with swooping curves. Italian scribes favored more classical Roman styles, and somewhere in between, a sleepy English novice accidentally invented Comic Sans. Okay, maybe not. Your hand starts to ache after the first hour, not just your fingers, but your wrist, your shoulder, your neck. You've been hunched over your desk, eyes straining, muscles frozen in the same micro-movements. There's no ergonomic setup here, no lumbar support, just a wood bench, a desk, and a prayer. You stretch, you roll your wrist, you whisper a Latin curse at your rebellious quill and carry on. Mistakes happen. When they do, you have options, none of them ideal. You can scrape the ink off gently with your penknife, but it leaves a mark. You can cross it out with tiny dots. You can add a note in the margin if you're bold. Or you can just pretend it didn't happen and hope future readers assume it's a stylistic choice. Fun fact, some scribes got clever. There's a famous marginal note that reads, "Oh, how difficult it is to write without making mistakes." Another says, "New parchment, bad ink." I say nothing more. And one brave soul just wrote, "This page is wretched, the pen is wretched, the ink is wretched." Clearly he was having a Monday, but for every ruined letter, there are 10 that come out perfect, or close enough. And when the script flows, when the ink glides, the lines align, the quill obeys, it feels like flying. Quiet, grounded, tiny flying. Like your spirit is dancing through your fingertips. You don't just write letters, you build them. Each character is a structure, a design. Some scripts have strict proportions, 2 nib widths tall, 1 wide with angled terminals. You measure with your eyes, you train your hand to repeat, to mimic, to know the rhythm. Calligraphy, they call it now. Back then it was just doing your job properly. Some quills were so well made they lasted for weeks. Others broke in minutes. And here's something weird. Scribes often chewed the ends of their quills, not for stress, though sure that too, but because the moisture softened the shaft, letting them reshape the nib on the fly. Monastic ASMR at its finest. Eventually, as the sun shifts, you pause. Your fingers are black-streaked. Your sleeve has an ink smudge. There's a tiny droplet on your robe you swear wasn't there this morning. Your penknife is dull. You need to sharpen it. again. You look at the work you've done. A full column of text, uniform, crisp, beautiful. The letters shine slightly where the ink hasn't fully dried. And in the margin, a small symbol, a curled tail on the Q, your quiet signature. You won't sign your name, you're just a monk, a conduit, but your quirks live in the curves of your letters, because even when you're copying someone else's words, the hand always leaves its mark. So there you are, ink drying on your hands, posture resembling a question mark, and quill in your grip like it's the only thing tethering your soul to this earthly realm. And today, you've been assigned the big one, the Holy Scriptures, not a romance of Alexander the Great, not a herbalist's manual, not even one of those weird morality plays where animals talk and somehow everyone ends up dead from pride. No, this is the Bible, the Latin Vulgate, to be precise, and not just any part of the Vulgate. You've drawn the Gospel of John, which means you're about to copy the words in principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. Fitting, isn't it? You dip your quill and begin with the most reverent, most polished, most painfully slow letters of your life. These are no ordinary sentences. These are sacred. Every line is considered a spiritual act. Every word is a prayer. Every breath a vow. Mistakes aren't just frowned upon. They're whispered about. You smudge a line from Leviticus and people glance at you like you've committed light blasphemy. Mess up a verse from the Gospels? You may as well pack up and find a monastery with lower standards and less aggressive eyebrows. Now, of course, you're copying from an exemplar. That's the master copy, kept under lock, key, and probably guarded by a monk who hasn't smiled since Charlemagne died. You're not adding your own flair. You're not improvising. This isn't jazz. This is transcription. You match word for word, letter for letter, punctuation mark for punctuation mark. And don't even think about altering spellings unless the abbot himself says so. The exemplar lies beside you on a tilted stand. Your left hand hovers over it while your right hand writes. You glance left, glance right, right. Glance left, glance right, right. It becomes rhythmic, monotonous, beautiful. And then, disaster. You skip a line, just like that. You go from et lux in tenebris lucet to erat homo misses a deo. You reread the passage, your stomach sinks. You feel the color drain from your face. Though let's be honest, it's mostly ink stains at this point. Now what? Some scribes would scrape off the error. Some would draw a tiny pointing hand, called a manicule, in the margin and add the missing line there. Others would just leave it and pray no one noticed. But not you. Not with Brother Adalbert lurking nearby like a pious hawk. You correct it, very carefully, but it haunts you. Which brings us to a fun fringe tidbit. Scribes sometimes left notes begging future readers not to judge their mistakes. One wrote, "If you find a fault, spare the copier." Another, even more passive-aggressive, scrawled, "It is easy to criticize writing, but hard to do it." Monastic mic drop. Back to you, though. You resume your transcription with renewed caution. Each word is deliberate. Verbum erat apud Deum. The word was with God, and you wonder, what exactly are you doing here? Are you just a copier? Or are you part of something bigger? Because when you copy scripture, you're not just duplicating words. You're preserving them, making them permanent. You're the last step in a divine relay race that started with prophets and apostles and somehow ended with you and your goose feather. You're turning the ephemeral into the eternal, one ink-stained letter at a time. Some scholars believe scribes are so spiritually attuned that they saw the act of copying scripture as a form of worship. The writing wasn't just a chore, it was salvation with ink. Others argue, more cynically, that many scribes were just doing what they were told under the threat of extra kitchen duty. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You copy because you must. Because you believe. Because it's beautiful. And because if you don't, someone else will, and they might be worse at Latin. You take a deep breath and lift your quill for a decorated capital. This is your moment, the big I of in principio. It has to be majestic, holy, the kind of eye that makes angels pause and admire your penmanship. You switch to a larger quill, broader nib, thicker lines. You outline the initial letter with a light touch. Then, using red ink, you begin to embellish. Curves, curls, floral extensions. Maybe a little dragon snaking through the loop. Because nothing says praise be like a decorative lizard. These decorated letters are known as illuminated initials. They announce the beginning of a major passage, and they're one of the few places where you, the scribe, can stretch your wings. Not too far. This isn't a Renaissance rave, but enough to show your individuality, enough to leave your mark. Here's a scholarly debate you might find amusing. Were the scribes and the illuminators always the same person? Some experts say yes, it was a one-monk show. Others argue that after you copied the text, the manuscript would be sent to another monk who specialized in illustrations. A kind of monastic tag team. Either way, it was slow. Painfully slow, but the results? Glorious. You continue. Line after line, paragraph after paragraph. Your handwriting becomes a meditation. You start to memorize the verses without trying. The repetition seeps into you. You recite them silently as you write. You dream in Latin. You hear Dominus vobiscum in your sleep. At one point, your quill snags on the parchment. A tiny tear forms. You sigh and reach for your penknife. You scrape gently. The parchment resists. You soothe it with a bit of powdered pumice and hope no one notices. You remember the rule. Never rest your hand on the ink. Always keep a slip of parchment between your palm and the letters. The last thing you need is a sweaty thumbprint on the Beatitudes. It's not a good look. By midday, you've completed a full folio. 2 pages, front and back. It took 4 hours. Your hand is trembling. Your eyes are crossing. You lean back, stretch, and yawn so wide your jaw cracks. Clarissa glances over and mouths something that looks like amateur. You respond with a well-timed quirk of your eyebrow. It's the monastic version of throwing shade. Lunch is a bland stew, silent as ever, eaten in a hall where every slurp echoes like a cannon. Afterward, you return to your station. More writing, more prayers, more weight. You flip back through your pages, admiring the slow crawl of ink and holiness across the parchment. It's not perfect, but it's yours, and it's God's. And maybe, just maybe, someone 1,000 years from now will run their fingers across these letters and feel a flicker of what you felt today. Reverence, tedium, beauty, cramped fingers, a fleeting, sacred connection across time. You reach for your quill and write again. It's been hours since you said a word, not a whisper, not a grunt, not even a muttered prayer. You've been completely silent, and not in the peaceful meditation under a tree kind of way. This is enforced silence. The rule says no talking during work hours, and your abbot is the kind of man who treats broken silence like a second sin after heresy. So you sit there, lips clamped shut, your every movement deliberate. You clear your throat and immediately regret it. You glance at Clarissa, who raises a single judgmental eyebrow, and go back to writing as if your life depends on it. Because, well, in some monasteries, your ink privileges actually do depend on it. Now, this isn't just some quirky religious flex. Silence was sacred. It created space for contemplation, discipline, and spiritual focus. According to the rule of St. Benedict, monks were to avoid idle words, and instead let their lives be filled with purposeful action and silent prayer. Which sounds poetic, until you need to ask someone to pass the ink. That's where things get creative. You develop a whole new language. Not Latin, not Greek, not even a spoken tongue, but a beautifully bizarre choreography of glances, hand gestures, eyebrow lifts, and sleeve tugs. You point to your ink jar. You mime a writing motion and then a shrug. The universal monk signal for, "Mine is empty, brother. Help a scribe out." Brother Marcus has invented a full finger dance routine for, "My back hurts, and I'm dying." Clarissa once conveyed, "The new novice spilled his ink and cried in the corner," entirely through mimed face palms and interpretive eye rolls. It's an art form, and it's hilarious. Quietly, of course. You even have signs for the essentials. Ink equals tap 2 fingers on your left palm. Quill equals flutter your fingers like a bird flapping. Knead knife. Halberdier to draw an invisible line across your forearm, mildly threatening but effective. Bathroom equals raise 2 fingers and look desperate. You'd be amazed how expressive monks can get when forbidden from speaking. Historians still debate just how formal these sign languages were. Some believe certain monasteries had standardized systems passed down from master to novice. Others argue they were more improvisational, each abbey developing its own internal dialect, sort of like monastic charades. But there are even 13th century texts that include diagrams of hand signs, suggesting that at least some monks took their silent communication very, very seriously. Now, the silence wasn't absolute. There were exceptions, like during confession, lessons, and communal readings. And then there were the loopholes. Oh, the loopholes. There's the talking room, also called the locutorium. That was your legal escape. Need to discuss theology or report that Brother Stephen just passed out face first into his psalter? Head to the talking room, but be warned, abusing it was frowned upon. Go there too often and you'd earn a reputation. And in a monastery, reputations are basically carved in stone. Then there's the note passing. Yes, monks passed notes on parchment scraps with ink, often in Latin, which is somehow both petty and profoundly elegant. One popular tactic was to write a tiny message on the edge of your own manuscript and angle it toward the monk next to you. Something like, page 47, you wrote ass instead of pass again. There's even a recorded case of a monk who, while forbidden to speak, wrote an entire complaint scroll about the poor ventilation in the scriptorium and passed it around like a medieval burn book. The abbot was not amused, but usually you follow the rule, because deep down, there's something powerful about the silence. You start to hear things you never noticed before. The scratching of 20 quills at once, the soft pop of air, bubbles in the ink, the quiet creak of the parchment as it bends, even your own heartbeat steady and calm, pulsing in your ears as you copy the Lord's Prayer for the 174th time. There's a kind of unity in it, too. Everyone focused, everyone still, everyone moving at the same slow rhythm. The silence becomes communal, not loneliness, but connection without words. Of course, that doesn't stop the occasional accidental violation, like when Brother Hugo sneezes loudly, violently, and then whispers, "Forgive me." Adalbert appears from the shadows like a judgmental bat. He doesn't yell, he doesn't scold, he simply stands, silent and looming, until Hugo shrinks into himself like a chastised hedgehog. Then Adalbert vanishes again, presumably back into the wall he materialized from. You get the message. You look down at your page. A psalm is halfway finished. The Latin dances across the parchment. Dominus illuminatio mea. The Lord is my light. You pause. You breathe. You dip your quill again. And then, from the far corner of the scriptorium, a fart. There's no hiding it. It echoes like a trumpet across the cold stone chamber. A beat of stunned silence, then a few shoulders tremble. Suppressed laughter. Clarissa bites her lip. You stare very hard at your manuscript, blinking rapidly, fighting the primal urge to lose it entirely. Brother Marcus, eyes red, starts shaking like a man in spiritual crisis, but no one speaks. No one moves. The code holds. Only later, much later, during the evening meal, will someone quietly slide a scrap of parchment across the table with a single word. Trumpetus. You're learning that silence isn't emptiness. It's texture. It's structure. It creates space where words actually matter. In a world where your every waking hour is dictated by bells, duties, and pages filled with divine commandments, silence becomes the only freedom you have left. Sometimes, as you scratch out another verse, you realize something strange. You don't want to speak. You like the quiet. You like the ritual. You like the stillness. Because in the silence, you can hear something deeper. Not just the rustle of robes and the breath of your brothers and sisters, but something softer, older, more enduring. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's discipline. Maybe it's your own tired thoughts, finally allowed to rise to the surface like dust motes in candlelight. You finish your final line of the day. Your wrist aches. Your eyes sting. Your stomach grumbles faintly, reminding you that silence doesn't apply to hunger. You place your quill down, cap the ink. Cover the parchment. And as you rise from your stool, you nod to Clarissa. She doesn't say anything, but her smirk says it all. You've made it halfway through the week, or the manuscript. It's hard to tell anymore. Your wrist is stiff, your back is in open rebellion, and the only sound louder than your silent suffering is the scratch of 20 quills tracing the lives of saints onto stretched animal skin. But today's lesson doesn't come from the text itself. It comes from the margins. Yes, the margins. The wide, blank spaces that frame each page. On the surface, they're just there to keep your words contained, to prevent lines from falling off the parchment like drunken monks at a wine festival. But if you think that's all they're for, you clearly haven't spent enough time surrounded by silent scribes with wildly active imaginations and a lot of repressed energy. Because tucked between the holy verses, beside the commandments and psalms, nestled against the gospels and prophecies, are tiny drawings, doodles, scribbles, marginalia, and they are glorious. Today, as you copy a rather dense passage from Deuteronomy, you glance down at your assigned exemplar and see it. A small rabbit, yes, a rabbit, brandishing a sword and standing triumphantly over a fallen knight. You blink, you stare, yep, still there, and now you're very awake. Welcome to the bizarre, hilarious, and occasionally unhinged world of medieval margin art. Nobody told you about this in novice training. Nobody warned you that amid the sacred text you'd find nuns with crossbows, snails waging war, cats playing the bagpipes, and monkeys doing, well, let's just say things that would make the abbot faint. There's debate, of course there's debate, about why scribes did this. Some scholars think it was pure boredom. Others argue it was subtle commentary, hidden critiques of authority, religion, or even the very manuscripts being copied. Some believe it was all symbolic, part of a forgotten code of visual metaphors. And still others think, quite reasonably, that after 5 straight hours of copying genealogies, the brain simply needed to draw a battle between a duck and a trumpet-wielding demon. Whatever the reason, these doodles exist, hundreds of them, thousands, across Europe, across centuries, and they're your favorite thing now. Clarissa once pointed out a unicorn vomiting into a chalice during Psalms. Brother Marcus has a folio with a cow lecturing a bishop. One novice found an entire miniature comic strip of a man being chased by a giant snail for 10 pages straight. The text never mentioned snails. There's no snail parable in the gospel, but here it is. Slow, relentless, and absolutely committed to the bit. Your own desk has a bit of history, too. Carved into the underside is a message. This page tried to kill me. Pray for me, O reader. You suspect Brother Hugo. He seems the type. And now that you've seen one drawing, you start noticing them everywhere. They're tucked between the lines, hidden in the flourishes. Sometimes they're so faint you only spot them when the candlelight hits just right. Mistakes, too, tell their own stories. You'd think holy manuscripts would be flawless. You'd be wrong. Scribes are human. They're tired. They're overworked. They have to use ink that eats through parchment and quills that split on Thursdays for no reason. Errors happen. One of the most common? Eye skip. You're copying line after line, and suddenly your eye jumps ahead, skipping an entire sentence. You don't notice until 3 paragraphs later when a psalm turns into nonsense, at which point you sigh so hard it disturbs the candle flame, reach for your knife, and start scraping. Some mistakes are minor, switched letters, duplicated words. Others are catastrophic, entire pages copied in the wrong order, whole books mislabeled. One scribe famously reversed 2 lines of Genesis, and it took 3 other monks to catch it, and 6 months to fix. And then there's the passive-aggressive commentary. A famous marginal note reads, "Thank God, it will soon be dark." Another, "I am very cold." And perhaps the most relatable, "Oh, my hand." One scribe even left a tiny sketch of a man weeping into a book. But not all marginalia are complaints. Some are full-on conversations. Scribes writing responses to earlier scribes. One will write, "This page is well made." The next will reply, "You lie. It is crooked." The medieval version of YouTube comment sections. And then, of course, there are the memes. We didn't invent sarcasm or weird jokes, or that chaotic impulse to draw something ridiculous next to something important. Take the Luttrell Psalter, a real manuscript, by the way. It features praying monks, detailed biblical scenes, and also a man playing bagpipes with his rear end. Why? No one knows, but it exists, and it's beautiful. Your own pages? Well, let's just say you're tempted. You glance around. The room is quiet. Adalbert is nowhere in sight. You pick up your smallest quill, the fine-tip one, the one you definitely only use for corrections. And in the corner of the margin, beneath a Latin phrase about divine mercy, you sketch a tiny cat chasing a bishop. Just a hint of satire, a dash of rebellion. You lean back, you smile. It's not disrespectful, it's commentary. Because here's the truth, being a scribe isn't just about perfect letters and flawless transcription. It's about presence. It's about being there. You're not a machine, you're a person. You live in these margins, you laugh in them, you cry in them, you leave yourself behind in them. And centuries from now, some scholar in a library will find your little cat and smile. They'll wonder who you were. They'll feel your fingers through the parchment, and they'll know, even in silence, you found a way to speak. Your back is screaming. Your knees feel like they're made of stone. And your fingers, well, you stop feeling those sometime after breakfast. Welcome to the physical reality of being a medieval scribe, something no one ever puts in the illuminated manuscripts or chants about in the chapel. Behind every perfectly penned gospel or exquisite psalter is a body falling apart in absolute silence. Let's talk about your posture, or more specifically, the lack of one. You're seated on a wooden stool with no cushion, no backrest, and no mercy. Your desk is slightly slanted, which helps a little with neck strain, but it also makes your ink jar constantly threaten to commit a slow-motion suicide. You hunch forward instinctively, trying to get the perfect angle to form the letter G without blotching it. Your shoulders cave in, your spine curls like a parchment roll, and your neck starts doing this weird crick thing whenever you turn your head even slightly. This is your life, bent, crooked, slowly turning into the letter S. You don't complain, mostly because you're not allowed to, but also because everyone else looks just as miserable as you. Brother Marcus now walks like he's got an invisible yoke tied to his shoulders. Clarissa does this neck roll every 20 minutes that sounds like someone cracking walnuts. And Brother Hugo, he hasn't stood up straight since Epiphany. So what do? Well, if you're lucky, your monastery is progressive enough to have a scriptorium chair, a rare and borderline magical piece of furniture with a slightly curved back and maybe, just maybe, a padded seat. But more often than not, you make do with what you've got. A cushion made from straw and old robes, a small wooden footstool, a rolled-up rag between your knees for support, and a prayer to Saint Benedict, patron of monks and maybe also scoliosis. Some monasteries tried to help. They built desks at different heights. They rotated tasks, copying, illuminating, binding, to shift muscle strain. But most just expected you to endure. After all, this is sacred work. And if Saint Jerome could translate the entire Bible into Latin while living in a cave, you can manage one psalm before lunch without crying. But let's be honest, you are crying. On the inside. Quietly, elegantly. Here's a weirdly interesting fact. Some scribes developed unique forms of physical compensation. One popular trick? The book pillow, a firm, cloth-stuffed wedge placed under the manuscript to elevate the page and reduce neck strain. It wasn't exactly ergonomic, but it helped. There's even evidence that monks used slanted reading frames, some of which had adjustable arms, to hold the exemplar beside the working page, like a primitive side-by-side monitor setup, only made of wood, leather, and divine hope. Still, your hands ache. You flex your fingers, stretch your palms, roll your wrists. Sometimes you take your penknife and press it lightly against your knuckles, not to hurt, but to stimulate blood flow. It helps, a little. You try to rotate your tasks. After 3 hours of copying, you move to rubrication, adding red ink for titles and emphasis. It uses different muscles slightly and gives your eyes a rest from black on beige. But even red gets old, and the cramping returns. Clarissa recommends stretching. She's a big believer in what she calls monastic yoga, which is really just standing up and flapping your arms like a rooster trying to fly. You try it once. You hit Brother Marcus in the nose. He forgives you, but you both agree never to speak of it again. There are worse injuries too, real ones. Quill cramp. A brutal stabbing pain that runs from your wrist up to your elbow. It can last for days. There's no treatment except rest. And nobody wants to rest when there are still 5 psalms left and Adalbert is hovering like a vulture in a cassock. Monk's hunch. A long-term spinal curve from years of bad posture. It doesn't go away. It becomes part of you. You meet retired scribes who walk like commas. No one talks about it directly. It's just understood. Then there's parchment rash. Because you've been handling animal skin processed with lime, chalk, and occasional mold spores. Your hands are raw. The skin peels at the edges, and you still have to write Psalm 137 without letting your tears smudge the ink. Some monks believed physical suffering made the work more holy, that every ache was a sacrifice, that every blister was a badge of spiritual commitment. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just a coping mechanism before aspirin and lumbar support existed. Either way, you endure. You learn tricks. You rest your elbows on rolled cloth. You slide a stone under your foot to shift your weight. You hold your quill with just the right grip, not too tight, not too loose. You memorize stretches that you perform subtly so Adalbert doesn't accuse you of flailing about like a drunken juggler, and you keep going. Because somehow, even with the pain, the stillness holds beauty. There's a strange peace in the routine, in the scratch of the quill, in the way your spine aligns, not comfortably, but predictably, with the flow of words across the page. You even start to anticipate the rhythm of the day based on the stiffness in your body. Lower back pain must be almost tierce, 9 a.m. Numb feet, definitely sexed, noon. The stabbing neck pang that feels like lightning? Congratulations, you made it to none, 3 p.m. By vespers, your body feels like it's been hit by a cart full of psalters, but you shuffle to the chapel anyway, shoulders slumped, knees creaking like monastery doors. And as you kneel for evening prayers, you smile faintly, because despite it all, despite the aching, the cramps, the endless pressure, you wrote today. You produced something that might survive longer than your bones, something that may sit in a cathedral library or a museum case, something that might, just might, carry a sliver of your soul. Because what is a book, really, if not a body made of thoughts? You drag yourself to bed, straw mattress, thin blanket, a stone for a pillow if you're feeling dramatic. And as you lay there, your spine still curled from hours of transcription, you whisper to the ceiling, Lord, grant me strength, and maybe a better chair. It's another gray morning in the scriptorium. Rain taps on the monastery's slate roof like a persistent editor tapping their foot, and the candlelight throws tall, twitchy shadows on the wall. You sit down at your desk, adjust your robe, and pull your parchment forward, ready to copy another dense block of Latin. But today you've been given a special text. Not scripture, not a prayer book, not even a hagiography about a saint who wrestled a bear or fasted for 87 years straight. No, today's work is theological commentary, words about God, not from God, and that means every single sentence is a landmine. Because here's the thing, monks didn't just copy texts, they filtered them. Welcome to the unnerving, complicated, and occasionally downright paranoid world of medieval censorship. You're expected to transcribe the text as is, of course, except when you're not. And nobody tells you clearly when as is becomes not. It's a bit like walking a tightrope blindfolded over a pit of theological lava. Copy too loosely, and you risk corrupting doctrine. Copy too literally, and you risk preserving ideas the church has since declared suspect. Copy too creatively, and someone might whisper that you're flirting with heresy. Which brings us to the first rule of Scribe Club. When in doubt, abbreviate. Latin has a whole system of shorthand. Nomina sacra, holy names like Deus, God, Christus, Christ, and Spiritus Sanctus, Holy Spirit, are routinely abbreviated to a few mysterious squiggles with lines over them. It's part efficiency, part reverence, part plausible deniability. If someone accuses you of misspelling Christ, you can always say, "Oh no, that's the sacred abbreviation. See the overline? That's a mark of devotion, not laziness." But deep down, you know it's also a convenient way to dodge controversial phrasing. Sometimes you strike whole passages quietly, carefully. Maybe you leave a blank space. Maybe you write a small cross in the margin like a monkish asterisk. Maybe you squeeze in a hasty gloss that says, "Textus corruptus, non intelligitur." The text is corrupt, unintelligible, even if you understood it perfectly. Adalbert taught you that one. He calls it the pious dodge. But you also learn that censorship isn't just about edits, it's about fear. Take the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God in Hebrew. It appears in early manuscripts, untranslated. Some scribes, unsure how to handle it, simply left a blank space or substituted Adonai or Dominus instead. Because writing God's true name was thought to invoke divine power or provoke divine wrath. Better safe than smitten. Even copying texts about angels requires caution. There are 9 accepted choirs of angels: seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, and angels. But what if your exemplar mentions an unapproved 10th, or names an angel not sanctioned by Rome? Do you write it down? Do you skip it? Do you annotate with a frown? Clarissa once copied an obscure mystical tract that mentioned an angel called Barachiel. She footnoted it with non-canon. Not canon, smart, sassy, survivalist. Then there's the devil. Mention him too much and you raise eyebrows. Mention him too little and people think you're avoiding the subject. Some texts describe demons in alarming detail. Horns, tails, thousands of wings, flaming swords. Others speak only of the tempter. And every time you copy those lines, you wonder, should you be more careful? Should you draw a protective cross in the margin? Maybe add a prayer? And here's where things get superstitious. Because scribes, especially those working on spiritual texts, had beliefs, private ones, secret ones, the kind no one admits out loud, but everyone sort of knows, like, don't drop your quill while writing the name of God, or don't sneeze while copying the devil's dialogue, or if your ink runs dry in a holy verse, pause and pray, because maybe it's a sign. Some monks kept relics on their desks, splinters of saints' bones, beads from old rosaries, even bits of hair from abbots long dead and hopefully buried. Brother Marcus has a sliver of wood he insists came from the true cross. You suspect it came from the true firewood pile, but you don't oppress. You've got your own ritual. Every time you begin a new folio, you trace a tiny cross into the margin with your thumbnail. No ink, no mark. Just pressure, just a touch. You don't tell anyone, but you do it every time. Because sometimes when you're copying a particularly heavy passage, say one about judgment or apocalypse, you feel it, a chill, a presence. Not malevolent necessarily, but watching, and it makes you want to be careful with your words, not just correct. Careful. Now here's a fringe tidbit for you. In some Irish monastic traditions, scribes would occasionally hide riddles or protective charms within their texts. A sort of textual talisman. Some used acrostics. First letters of each line spelling out prayers. Others embedded symbols drawn from local folklore. Triple spirals, knots, or sacred animals. It wasn't official doctrine, but it made them feel safe. And speaking of symbols, there's the infamous cursiva maledicta, literally the cursed script. According to monastic legend, there was a style of writing, jagged, spidery, uneven, that invited misfortune. If a manuscript was copied in cursiva maledicta, it might bring bad luck to the reader. Pages would fall out, the ink would fade, rats would eat only that book on the shelf. Adalbert dismisses this as nonsense, but when he found Brother Hugo copying a psalter in what could technically be called cursiva maledicta, he made him start over and lit incense, just in case, so you keep your letters neat. You abbreviate what needs to be abbreviated. You skip what seems dangerous. You annotate what seems suspicious. And you cross your fingers, spiritually of course, because while you may be a faithful scribe, you are also a deeply cautious one, and in a world where books shape eternity, a single ink blot can feel like an invitation to judgment. By the end of the day, your page is done. Clean, precise, maybe a little too precise. You glance down at one questionable phrase about celestial intermediaries. You were supposed to copy it exactly, but you left out 2 words on purpose. You'll say the ink smudged, you'll say the exemplar was faded, you'll say whatever Adalbert needs to hear. Because while the Word of God may be eternal, your spine, your ink supply, and your sense of job security definitely are not. By now, you're probably used to imagining a medieval scribe as a robed, stooped-over monk with a beard that could be used as a bookmark. Fair. That image isn't wrong, but it's not the whole story either. Because while men filled most scriptoriums, you're about to discover a chapter of history written in quieter ink. The women scribes. They weren't the majority, they weren't always acknowledged, but they were there. Behind convent walls, seated at their own narrow desks, copying texts, with the same precision, the same aching fingers, and often with even more to prove. Today you're in for a surprise. Adalbert, yes, the hawk-like, ink-sniffing chief scribe, has arranged a joint copying project with the nearby convent. That's right, co-ed transcription. Try to contain your excitement. When the nuns arrive, they're cloaked in the same dull, humble wool as you, but their energy is different, not louder, just steadier, focused. They walk with the self-assurance of people who have mastered the art of being underestimated. Clarissa, of course, greets them like returning heroes. She knows half of them by name. One in particular, Sister Isolde, has a reputation, not for scandal, but for speed. The legend goes that she once copied the entire Book of Ruth in 3 days without a single blot. You're skeptical, but after 10 minutes watching her work, you're no longer sure she isn't powered by divine caffeine. So yes, women were scribes, and not just in some fringe, isn't that cute way. They were serious, educated, methodical, especially in the nunneries of Germany, France, and Anglo-Saxon England. Convents often had their own scriptoria, their own illuminators, and their own libraries, and in many cases they weren't just copying the work, they were creating it. We're talking prayers, psalters, medical texts, even original theology. Some nuns were known for their marginalia too, playful, clever, sometimes cryptic. Sister Christina of Mark 8 allegedly slipped tiny messages into her texts. Some think they were spiritual reflections. Others think they were inside jokes meant for specific readers. Either way, they survived, and that says something. The problem? Most of the time, the women didn't sign their names. Not out of shame, but because they weren't allowed to, or didn't think it mattered, or believed the work should speak for itself. But every now and then, they left clues. Fingerprints in the margins, tiny monograms hidden in elaborate initials. Or, in one famous case, traces of lapis lazuli in the teeth of a buried nun, indicating she likely painted manuscript decorations with her lips close to the page, possibly licking the brush to get a perfect point, which, incidentally, is also how Clarissa sharpens hers. Maybe it's a nun thing. Scholars used to assume that scribal work was a male-only domain, that women weren't educated enough, that they didn't have access to the necessary training. But then came the evidence, and more evidence, and then the stubborn, undeniable fact that someone had to have written the manuscripts found in women's convents. Now, there's an open debate. Were female scribes more common than we thought? Or were they always rare, but highly trained? Some experts argue that women were involved more in corrections, annotations, and decoration, support roles. Others say no. The best of them ran their own scriptoria, taught novices, and shaped intellectual life in their own cloistered worlds. One thing's for sure, when they wrote well. You glance over at Sister Isolde's work again. It's clean, precise, almost painfully elegant. Even her mistakes look graceful. She notices you staring and offers a polite nod. No smugness, just quiet confidence. The kind that comes from decades of writing while being quietly erased from the narrative. There's a strange kinship in the room today. The usual hierarchy of the scriptorium feels looser, lighter. Clarissa cracks a smile. Brother Marcus makes room at his table without grumbling. Even Adalbert seems less terrifying. He walks slower, speaks softer. Maybe he remembers that half the psalms he's memorized were probably copied by women centuries ago. At lunch, the nuns eat separately, of course. Monastic rules still apply. But you can feel the shared exhaustion, the shared reverence, the shared understanding of what it means to carry the word through ink. Back at your desk, you consider something you hadn't before. How many texts you've copied, how many prayers, sermons, gospels might have come through female hands before yours. How many silent sisters shaped the faith you now transcribe, and how many more went unrecognized. There's an old manuscript from the 12th century. It has a tiny, almost invisible line in the margin that reads, "Pray for her who wrote this." No name, no flourish, just the plea. A whisper across time, a reminder that someone was here, someone who dared to ask to be remembered. You wonder if Isolde will write something like that. You wonder if you will. The day winds down. The nuns pack up their tools, their ink horns, their cloth-wrapped parchment. They leave quietly, like they arrived. Isolde doesn't say goodbye. She just places a folded scrap on Clarissa's desk and walks out. Clarissa unfolds it, smiles. You don't ask what it says. You don't need to. Because some words aren't for you. You sit at your desk, rubbing your fingers over a single sheet of parchment, and a strange thought hits you. This page might be worth more than you are. It's not an exaggeration. In a world without printing presses, paper mills, or office supply stores, every book is a miracle. Every letter you write is part of something that costs a small fortune, financially, physically, spiritually. Books aren't just rare in the medieval world. They're precious, sacred, often chained to desks so no one steals them. Literally. Let's break it down. Start with the materials. First, the parchment. As we've discussed, that smooth, creamy sheet in front of you used to be part of a very confused cow. A single calf skin might yield 3 or 4 usable sheets, maybe more if you're good at scraping. A full Bible? That could take up to 200 skins. 200. Imagine the herd you'd need to just stock a one monastery library. And the cost? One sheet of vellum could be worth as much as a laborer's daily wage. Multiply that by hundreds. Add in the time to process the skin. Stretch it, scrape it, sand it, and cut it. This isn't a weekend arts and crafts project. This is a slow-motion sacrifice. Then there's the ink. Iron gall, painstakingly brewed from gallnuts and rusted metal. Not cheap, not easy. And don't even think about spilling it. That's a sin in some scriptoriums. A literal stain on your soul. Next up, the quills. Sure, they grow on birds, but not just any feathers will do. You want primary flight feathers from the left wing of a goose. Strong, curved, and tough enough to be reshaped again and again. Each one only lasts a few days at most. Multiply that by the months it takes to write a full manuscript, and you're looking at an entire flock's worth of writing tools. Now imagine illuminating the manuscript. That's a whole other cost layer. Lapis lazuli for blue, imported from Afghanistan, costs more than gold. Gold leaf for initials, hammered so thin it could float in sunlight, applied with egg whites and a prayer. Red ink, cinnabar or vermilion, expensive, toxic, and difficult to prepare. Green, verdigris, made by letting copper corrode and then collecting the patina like a very fashionable mold. Every color has a story. Every detail has a price. Some manuscripts were so elaborate they were commissioned by royalty, nobility, or high-ranking clergy. Entire abbeys might work for years on a single copy of the Bible or a book of hours. These weren't books you kept on your bedside table. These were books you locked in a chest, displayed on an altar, or read from during Mass like they were the Holy Grail, because to some, they practically were. There's a real historical example, the Lindisfarne Gospels. Created in the 8th century, it's one of the most beautifully illuminated manuscripts in existence. It took years to complete, and it wasn't just valuable in gold and vellum. It was considered spiritually potent. Pilgrims traveled just to see it. Some believed simply looking at the pages could grant healing. Closer to home, your own abbey's library contains maybe 30 books total. That's it, 30, and that's considered impressive. Most peasants in nearby villages will never even see a book. They'll hear scripture read aloud. They'll memorize psalms and prayers, but they'll never turn a page with their own hands. Books are status. Books are treasure. Books are chained. Yes, chained. Monasteries often attach metal chains to valuable manuscripts and lock them to shelves or desks, not to be dramatic, but to be practical. One stolen book could bankrupt a scriptorium, could unravel a year's worth of work, could be lost forever in a world with no backups, no cloud, no choral process. Some monks even included book curses in their manuscripts, actual curses. One example reads, "Whoever steals this book, let him die the death. Let him be frizzled in a pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him." Another goes with, "If anyone takes this book, may he be excommunicated, damned, and struck with leprosy." Cheerful stuff. You consider writing your own curse, something modest, like, "If thou takest this text, may thy ink always blot, and thy quill forever squeak." But back to cost. Even a modest book, say a psalter, might cost the equivalent of a small farm. It could be traded for livestock. It could seal a dowry. In some cases, it was given as a gift to curry favor with a bishop or a noble. The book wasn't just an object. It was currency, prestige, a statement, "Look what I have. Look what I can afford to preserve." There's ongoing debate among scholars about the actual cost in medieval currency. Some say a full Bible could cost the same as a house. Others argue that monasteries produced texts in-house and didn't factor in labor costs, so the value was more symbolic than monetary, but either way, it was never casual. That's why every stroke of your quill matters. That's why Adelbert glares at you like you've broken an oath when your margin is half a thumb too wide. That's why Clarissa muttered a novena last week when a novice knocked over an ink jar and stained 3 days of work. Because this isn't just transcription, this is preservation, this is memory, this is legacy with a price tag. When a manuscript was finished, it was bound, by hand of course, with thread, leather, and wood. Covers were decorated, reinforced, sometimes even embedded with gems. Not because it needed sparkle, but because it needed protection and reverence. You don't just toss a $10,000 book on the shelf. You encase it like a relic. You once heard of a monastery that lost 5 books in a fire. Not lives. Books. And the abbey held a week of mourning. Somewhere deep in a locked cupboard, your abbey houses its most sacred manuscript. A Latin Bible copied in the 11th century, bound in iron, sealed with a brass lock. You've never seen it. Only Adelbert holds the key. But you think about it often, because maybe, just maybe, one day the book you are copying right now will be sealed in a box too. Not for hiding, but for safekeeping. Because in this world, books are more than parchment and ink. They're time capsules, they're prayers made physical, their voices, silent, enduring, and painfully expensive. It begins with a whisper, carried in by a traveling merchant or a dusty scholar on pilgrimage. A new invention, a device that can copy books without quills, without scribes, without aching backs and ruined eyes. You hear the word once, in passing, pressa. You dismiss it naturally, just some absurd rumor from the German lands. Probably an exaggeration, another tale of flying machines or dragons with the ability to read. But then you hear it again, and then you see the look on Adalbert's face. He doesn't say much, he never does, but when the letter arrived from Mainz, you think, you caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, not curiosity, something worse, doubt. And that's when you realize something's changed. The quill is no longer the only way to copy the word. There's something else now, something made of wood and metal, something that uses movable letters, tiny blocks, each carrying a raised character, arranged, inked, and pressed onto paper in seconds, movable type. The press has arrived. Well, not literally here, not yet. Your scriptorium still smells like wet wool, burning tallow and fermented ink. But you feel it, a shift in the air, like the echo of a bell you didn't hear but somehow still felt in your bones. You learn the name, Gutenberg, Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith apparently, clever with metals, clever with machines, and definitely clever enough to shake the foundations of everything you've spent your entire life doing. You try to picture it. Letters made of lead, not ink. Pressed onto paper, not parchment. Pages printed a dozen at a time, books finished in weeks, not years. No quills, no penknives, no scraped fingers or late-night candlelight migraines. It sounds like sorcery. Brother Marcus scoffs when you mention it. He says machines can't copy with reverence, that no one will ever value a printed page the way they value a hand-copied gospel. Clarissa just shrugs. Let them print, she says, flipping her quill. I'll still write better. You want to agree, but a seed of worry plants itself deep inside. Because if they can copy faster and cheaper and en masse, then what happens to you? You start noticing things. More travelers arriving with books. Small, portable, affordable. Their pages are neat, uniform, strangely cold. The margins are tight, the ink is dark, and when you hold one in your hands, something inside you recoils. It's not bad exactly, but it's not yours. It doesn't breathe, it doesn't whisper, it doesn't bleed effort. A printed book is a marvel, but it lacks the madness of human touch. Still, you know what this means. Gutenberg's press changes everything, not overnight, not everywhere, but the tide is coming. You hear of cities setting up presses, Venice, Cologne, Paris, scribes replaced with typesetters, monks replaced with merchants, ink replaced with oil-based mixtures that roll, not drip. There's a deep scholarly debate happening now, and you're stuck in the middle of it. Some argue the press is divine providence, making the word accessible to the masses, finally fulfilling the Great Commission to spread truth across every land and tongue. Others, they see it as dilution, as sacrilege, as the cheapening of the sacred. If anyone can own a Bible, will it still feel holy? If anyone can print a text, who guards against corruption? Because it turns out scribes weren't just copyists, they were curators, filters, guardians, and now anyone with a press and a pocket full of lead letters can produce a book. A monk's labor reduced to a machine's rhythm, and yet you can't deny the awe. You hear about a man who printed 200 copies of the Bible in Latin with matching pages in weeks. Your whole abbey only has 2 full Bibles. One of them is chained to the altar. The other is missing 4 chapters of Leviticus and half a back cover. 200. There's even talk of books in vernacular languages, not just Latin, German, French, English. You wince at the thought. Latin was your gatekeeping, your holy firewall, a barrier that kept sacred knowledge in sacred hands. And now someone is teaching farmers to read. You try not to think about what this means. You try not to count the days. You try not to measure the value of your work against the cold efficiency of the press. But you do, because you're human, and because you're scared. Adalbert calls a meeting rare, formal. He stands at the head of the scriptorium, back straight, voice like gravel, and he says quietly, "This press will spread the word, but the word is still ours to preserve." You realize then it's not a competition, not exactly. The press can multiply, but it can't illuminate, it can't feel. It doesn't know what it's writing, it doesn't pause on a sacred name, it doesn't whisper a prayer before beginning a new gospel. You do. You will. You may not outlast the machine, but your work will, because the books you've made carry more than ink. They carry breath, sweat, intent, care. They carry you. You go back to your desk, you pick up your quill, and you write, not because you're faster, not because you're cheaper, but because your hand still has something to say. Even in a world that's starting to hum with the rhythm of the press, there's still a place for ink-stained silence. And in that silence, you write like you always have, one letter at a time. It's quieter now, not in the scriptorium, though it's emptier than it used to be, but in the world. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Not silence exactly, just the strange hush of something that's changed for good. The press is everywhere now. Cities you've never visited hum with the rhythm of gears and ink rollers. New books flood the land, cheap, fast, bold things, printed sermons, printed science, printed satire. some barely edited, some bursting with errors that would make Adalbert throw himself into a barrel of gall ink. And yet, you are still here, still writing, still dipping your quill, still scraping your parchment, still whispering a prayer before copying sacred lines. You are one of the last of the ink monks, the parchment people, the ones who never forgot that a book is more than a container. It's a conversation. You remember when the scriptorium was full? Desks packed tight, a sea of hunched backs, flickering candles, ink jars sweating beside the fire. Now there are fewer of you. Brother Marcus is gone, transferred to a town abbey to help manage printed tract distribution. Clarissa? She went rogue. Last you heard, she joined a merchant family as a manuscript decorator for the wealthy. Sister Isolde still sends the occasional letter, always neat, always brief, describing how her convent now trains girls to read printed books aloud, even if they don't write them. And Adalbert? He still walks the room, quieter now, as if the weight of the world has finally caught up to the man. His beard is whiter, his eyes sink deeper in their sockets. But when he looks at your page, he nods, and that's enough. Because now your job has shifted. You're not just copying the word, you're preserving art. The press can mass-produce pages, but it can't replicate the glow of gold leaf. It can't trace the delicate flourish of an illuminated letter that took 4 hours and a cramped wrist to perfect. That's why nobles still commission handwritten books of hours. That's why bishops still demand illuminated copies of their sermons to present as gifts. That's why collectors, wealthy, curious, slightly snobbish collectors, pay more than the manuscript's weight in silver to own something made by hand. You've become rare, not obsolete, not yet, just rare. Your role is smaller now, fewer texts, more ornament. You're asked to beautify things, not just copy them. Sometimes you write a single sentence on a page, a single psalm, a family motto in Latin, a letter from a saint etched in ink and haloed with gold. And you're okay with that. There's dignity in being the last. Of course, it's not always so graceful. There are moments of resentment. You visit a nearby town and see printed books stacked high like bread in the market. You see boys with dirty fingernails leafing through stories of saints and soldiers like they're nothing more than entertainment. You see a merchant's wife reading a book of herbal remedies and scoffing at the spelling. You see a child tearing a page out of a cheap devotional to make a paper boat. And something in you aches. Because you know what went into those words, even if they didn't. There's a debate among the monks now. One side says the scribal tradition is dead and that it's time to accept the press, move on, modernize. The other side says no, it's not dead. It's evolved, like candlelight after sunrise, less needed but still beautiful. You find yourself somewhere in the middle. You copy fewer texts now, but each one means more. There's talk of archiving your work. Not for circulation, but for preservation. The abbey is building a vault, a cold, dry chamber carved into the rock beneath the library. They're storing manuscripts there, manuscripts like yours, to protect them from fire, from rotary, from forgetting. Because even if no one reads them now, someone might, someday, and you want them to find something worth remembering. So you take more care than ever. You prepare your own ink. You select your parchment with reverence. You carve your quills like a sculptor working in miniature. You spend an entire morning decorating a single capital P in a verse about patience. You add vines, leaves, a fox curled around the tail of the letter. You sneak in a tiny crescent moon, barely visible. Your own signature, hidden in beauty. You take your time, because time is the one thing the press can't give. And here's a truth you never expected. Now that you're no longer rushed, now that you're not under pressure to fill page after page, you actually enjoy it more. You write slowly, carefully, you hum while you work. You take breaks to stand in the courtyard and stretch your spine, to let the wind carry the smell of ink from your hands. You become less of a copyist, more of a craftsman. One day a visitor arrives, a scholar from a distant university. He's heard of the abbey's last remaining scribe. He wants to see you work. You expect questions, you expect judgment, but instead he sits in silence for half an hour, just watching. Then he says softly, "You know, the press makes books, but you make manuscripts." And you realize he gets it. Not everyone will, but some do. And that's enough. Because maybe you're not the last scribe. Maybe you're just a bridge, a quiet link between one world and the next. And when your hands are too old and your eyes too dim, and your quill finally breaks for good, maybe someone else will pick it up. Not because they have to, but because they want to. And maybe, just maybe, they'll add their own flourish to the margins. The press isn't bad, you realize. It's just different. The world has changed, and with it, your understanding of your role. At first it was fear that your labor, your hands, your sweat, your ink was being rendered obsolete, overtaken by something mechanical, something cold, something too fast to appreciate the careful effort that had once been necessary. But then you pause, letting the thought settle, and you begin to wonder, what would have happened if the press had come a century earlier? What if it had never come at all? What if books had stayed the domain of scribes, locked away from most, and only a few could touch them? That was the world before. The world of slow, painstaking manuscripts that only the rich and the church could afford. The world where a single book might take a decade to create and could cost a fortune. Now the press brings the text to the people. It spreads the word faster than your quill ever could. And yes, maybe it sacrifices a bit of beauty along the way. The fine curves of an M here, the delicate twirl of a Q there. But in return, it brings access, the most sacred thing of all. A farmer in a far-off village doesn't need to wait for a scribe to finish a single copy of a prayer book. He can buy it at the market. A priest in a rural town doesn't need to travel to a monastery to read the Gospels aloud to his congregation. He can have a copy in his own hands. It wasn't supposed to be this way. You thought the press would drown out the sacred in favor of the practical. But something unexpected happens. The people embrace both. The press doesn't erase the past. It amplifies it. It doesn't strip away the importance of the manuscript. It elevates the role of the scribe. Now, the scribe is not just a copyist, but a curator of knowledge. The press makes books, but it's the scribes, you, who still make them special. You remember the first time you ever saw a printed book. It was small, made of thin paper that looked like it could tear at a touch. The letters were perfect, too perfect, almost mechanical. And yet, you felt something, a quiet thrill, deep inside. Because even in this cold, mass-produced text, you recognized the rhythm of the work. You saw the echoes of your own life, your own quill. And here's the odd thing you never expected. The printed book can't do what you do. It can't give people that quiet, humble connection to the text. It can't wrap the soul in the slow, sacred rhythm of ink on parchment. You have that. You always will. And here you are, still at the desk. The world outside presses on. The machines hum. The ink stains your fingers. But in your heart, you know, there will always be a place for the last scribe. It might not be loud. It might not be necessary in the way it once was, but it will always matter. Because what you create isn't just a book. It's a memory. It's a soul. It's the thread that ties us to the past and allows us to carry it forward gently, carefully, with reverence and respect. So let the press fill the world with its books. Let it make thousands of copies in a heartbeat. Let it carry the words farther than your hands ever could. You will still be here in the quiet spaces of ink and parchment. You will still be here because there will always be those who seek to hold a piece of the past, to feel the weight of time in their hands, to see the labor in every letter. You will still be here because, in the end, the press can make many books, but it can never replace the soul of the scribe who writes them. The years pass, slowly, imperceptibly, like ink, soaking into parchment. You don't notice the depth of the change until one day, when you're bending over a manuscript with a quill in your hand, you feel the weight of time on your back. Your fingers ache more now. The quill is heavier. The ink jar seems more distant than it used to be, as if it belongs to another life. But you are still here, still writing. You've taught the younger novices. You've passed down the secrets, the way to hold the quill just so, the perfect angle to cut the nib, the sacred way to breathe while transcribing verses. You've whispered to them about the quiet beauty of a well-formed A, about the delicate balance between speed and precision, about the importance of letting your soul rest within each letter. And now they are writing. You watch them, their fingers careful and slow. They do not understand the weight of what they are doing, not yet, but they will. They'll understand the way a manuscript becomes a part of the world, how it holds the breath of the past and carries it forward into the future. They'll come to know the fragility of each page, the importance of each stroke. And one day, perhaps, they'll become the last scribe too. You think about the press again. It's still everywhere, still making books faster than you could ever copy them. Books spill from the presses like the floodwaters of Noah's Ark, and the world is drowning in pages. But you no longer see it as a threat, no longer a rival. The press is just another tool, like the quill, like the ink, like the parchment. It will be used, it will print, it will multiply, but it will never feel the way a handwritten manuscript does. It will never whisper the same way. It will never hold the soul of a person, still warm with life, pressed into each letter. And when you die, and you know it's coming, it always is, you'll leave behind manuscripts. Not hundreds of them, not thousands, but the ones you've worked on will be there, scattered throughout the abbey, carefully locked in a chamber, some in the library, some tucked into corners, some left on the altar, touched only by the hands of the faithful and the curious. And when they open them, the future people, centuries from now, they'll feel it. They'll feel the weight of your ink-stained hands in every letter. They'll feel the hours you spent, the prayer, the ache, the moments you took to whisper the sacred words, to think deeply about their meaning, to be present in the creation of each page. They'll trace your letters with fingers that have never known a quill and never will. But they'll know. They'll feel something ancient, something beyond the cold print and the mechanical efficiency of the press. That is your legacy. Not the books you copied, not the manuscripts you finished, but the feeling that was embedded in every page, the care that went into every line. That is what survives. That is what lives beyond ink, beyond parchment, beyond time. You can hear the faint sound of a bell. Vespers is approaching, and the air in the scriptorium is as heavy as ever with the weight of history. You know you have one last manuscript to complete, one last verse to copy, and then the press will take over. The presses are faster, they are better, but you've created something that will always belong to the world of hands, of ink, and of soul. You finish the last letter of the last page, and as you do, you hear the soft, familiar scratch of your quill on parchment. It's still your work, your legacy, and in the silence that fills the room, you smile. You've made your mark, not just on paper, not just on the page, but on time itself. And now, as the evening sun begins to dip below the horizon, the monastery breathes. You close your eyes and let the ink rest.